Get your hands off that car right now, and don't move. You don't belong here." The officer's voice was loud, public, and sharpened with intent. It was meant to strip dignity before it stripped freedom. Seconds later, Marcus Thompson was driven face first into the asphalt. His arm twisted until pain exploded through his wrist, a knee forcing down on his neck while strangers watched him pinned, humiliated, and bleeding. In that moment, long before courts or verdicts, the officers pressing him into the ground destroyed their own careers, their futures, and the authority they believed could never be questioned. Before going any further into this story, where are you watching from? If you believe stories like this matter and accountability still has a place in modern America, subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Your support helps ensure these stories are heard. Marcus Thompson lay still beneath the weight, controlling his breathing with deliberate precision. Panic would only give them what they wanted. At 45 years old, with 25 years of service behind him in the San Francisco Police Department, he had learned that calm was a form of resistance. He understood exactly what was happening and exactly why. He also understood something none of the officers surrounding him yet knew. This was his first official morning as chief of the Oak Ridge Police Department. He had arrived early on purpose. He wanted to see the town before ceremony and speeches, before introductions and press photos. He wanted to observe quietly. He parked at the Shell station across from headquarters, filled his tank, and watched the building where he would soon lead an entire department. The suit he wore was not flashy, but it was precise. Everything about Marcus reflected discipline earned the hard way. To John Harlon, that discipline meant nothing. Harlon did not see a seasoned lawman. He saw a black man in a luxury car, in a place he believed still answered to him. John Harlon had spent 2 decades on the force and even longer cultivating resentment. He believed the world had passed him by. He believed promotions were stolen, respect was diluted, and authority was slipping from men like him. When he saw Marcus, something inside him hardened instantly. This was not curiosity. It was judgment already formed, with Mike Donnelly beside him, younger, eager, and unsure of himself. Harlon crossed the street with purpose. The cruiser blocked the exit. The tone was set before the first word was spoken. Marcus turned slowly, hands visible, posture calm. He recognized the pattern immediately. He asked, politely, for the reason he was being detained. Harlon answered with contempt instead of law. He questioned ownership. He questioned belonging. Each sentence was designed not to investigate, but to dominate. Marcus responded the only way a professional could. He stated facts. He asserted rights. He did not raise his voice. That composure only seemed to anger Harlon more. As the minutes passed, the audience grew. Mothers paused beside their vehicles. A construction worker stopped mid-step. Teenagers lifted their phones openly. A gas station employee began recording without hesitation. A retired professor, who had seen abuse of power decades earlier, recognized it instantly and stayed. Marcus spoke clearly. Aware of every camera, he gave his name. He refused consent to any search. He asked again for legal justification. Each word was deliberate, spoken not for the officers, but for history. Donnelly claimed to smell drugs. Marcus knew the lie. Harlon escalated. 2 more officers arrived. None intervened. Silence became agreement. Authority became a circle, closed tight around a single man. Marcus felt the shift before the violence. He reached for his phone to document badge numbers, and Harlon shouted a false warning meant to excuse what came next. The takedown was sudden and brutal. Marcus's face struck the ground hard. His wrist bent the wrong way. Pain surged through his arm, sharp and immediate. Harlon's knee came down on his neck with intent, not control. Commands were shouted that Marcus was already obeying. Around them, voices rose in protest. Someone screamed for them to stop. The retired professor stepped forward and was shoved aside. Phones continued recording. The truth was being preserved from every angle. Donnelly saw the cameras and panicked. Fear replaced confidence. He turned away just long enough to rake his own throat, tearing skin, drawing blood. When he faced the crowd again, he shouted an accusation, hoping chaos would replace clarity. Marcus, struggling to breathe, still spoke. His voice was strained but steady. He named the act. He identified the offense. He did so with the calm authority of a man who knew the law not as a weapon, but as a responsibility. Harlon pressed harder, anger now mixed with something close to desperation. Then everything changed. As Marcus was hauled upright to be cuffed, his torn jacket shifted. Sunlight caught metal at his waist. A badge, heavy, official, unmistakable. A witness gasped. The crowd fell silent. Harlon looked down and froze. The authority he had been abusing stood before him, injured, restrained, and undeniably in command. Marcus straightened as much as his body allowed. Blood marked his face. His left arm hung useless. His voice carried across the station, firm and controlled. He identified himself as chief. He listed the violations calmly, precisely, without drama. Each word landed like a verdict. Shock rippled outward. Donnelly stumbled backward. One officer lowered his eyes. Another froze with a hand half raised to his radio. Marcus did not shout. He did not threaten. He took control. He ordered immediate suspensions. He requested federal investigators. He did so while cameras rolled and witnesses cried out in disbelief and relief. This was not a misunderstanding. It was exposure, a moment when power met evidence and collapsed. On a quiet Wednesday morning, in full public view, the old guard revealed itself exactly as it was, and in doing so, it handed Marcus Thompson the clearest mandate any leader could ever receive. Marcus Thompson remained upright only because discipline had trained him to endure pain without surrendering control. His breathing was shallow but steady. Every movement around him confirmed what he already knew. This was no routine stop. This was an assertion of power, carried out without cause and without restraint. John Harlon paced in front of him, circling like a man performing for an audience he believed would always side with him. Mike Donnelly hovered close, watching Harlon's reactions, mirroring his posture, trying to learn what loyalty looked like in moments like this. The two additional officers, Sophia Ramirez and Chris Fletcher, stood back but close enough to signal alignment. No one told Harlon to stop. That silence mattered. Harlon leaned in, close enough that Marcus could smell stale coffee on his breath. "You still haven't told me why you're really here," he said, his voice low but sharp, chosen carefully to provoke. Marcus did not answer the question because it was not a real question. Instead, he spoke to the record. He stated again that he was legally parked, that he had committed no crime, and that he did not consent to any search of his person or vehicle. His voice carried clearly. Phones continued to record. Harlon's jaw tightened. He did not want clarity. He wanted submission. Donnelly took a step closer to the passenger side of the car and pretended to sniff the air. "I'm detecting a strong odor of marijuana," he announced, loud enough for witnesses to hear. Marcus turned his head slowly. "That statement is false," he said. "There are no illegal substances in my vehicle. I do not use them." The lie hung in the air, unsupported and obvious. It did not matter. Harlon nodded as if it were confirmed fact. Probable cause invented itself in real time. Harlon reached out and took Marcus's wallet without permission. He flipped it open, rifling through identification with deliberate disrespect. "San Francisco," he muttered. "That explains a lot." He looked up with a thin smile. "People like you come here thinking rules don't apply." Marcus felt the familiar weight of history pressing down. He had heard variations of that sentence his entire life. He did not respond emotionally. He responded precisely. He informed Harlon that taking his property without consent or cause was unlawful. He stated that the detention was illegal. He asked, again, for a supervisor. The request irritated Harlon more than any accusation could have. To him, it sounded like defiance. He gestured sharply, and within moments the situation expanded. Another cruiser arrived, then another. Radios crackled. The circle tightened. Marcus counted faces, counted cameras, counted witnesses. He understood that what happened next would not stay contained. That knowledge steadied him. Inside the gas station, Luisa Gomez watched with growing alarm. She had seen this before, though never this openly. She stepped closer to the window, holding her phone steady. Outside, Dr. Eleanor Hayes stood with her keys still in hand, unable to walk away. She recognized the imbalance immediately. She recognized the tone. She recognized the danger. Years of teaching constitutional law had taught her how quickly rights vanished when authority went unchecked. Harlon's voice grew louder. "You're being detained," he said. "Step away from the vehicle." Marcus complied slowly, deliberately, narrating each movement. He did not reach suddenly. He did not argue. He did not resist. He stated clearly that he was complying under protest. The officers heard the words. They chose to ignore them. Donnelly shifted nervously. He glanced at the phones, at the bystanders, at Harlon. His confidence began to waver. Harlon noticed and responded the only way he knew how. He escalated. He stepped closer, chest nearly touching Marcus's. "In this town," he said, "you show respect." The implication was unmistakable. Marcus met his gaze without flinching. "Respect is not demanded," he replied calmly. "It is earned through lawful conduct." That sentence broke something fragile. Harlon's face hardened. He took a step back, then another, as if preparing himself. Marcus sensed the change immediately. He knew what came next. He reached slowly for his phone, not to threaten, not to provoke, but to document. Harlon shouted before Marcus could finish the movement. He shouted words that would later echo in courtrooms and news broadcasts. A false warning, a justification invented too late. The violence came fast. Marcus was driven to the ground with force meant to overwhelm. Pain exploded through his body, sharp and disorienting. His face struck the pavement. His wrist bent until it failed. He heard the crack before he felt the full weight of it. Then the knee came down on his neck, heavy and deliberate. Air narrowed, voices blurred. Commands were shouted that made no sense. "Stop resisting," Harlon yelled. Even as Marcus lay still, the crowd reacted instantly. Shouts rose. Someone screamed for them to stop. Dr. Hayes rushed forward, grabbing at Harlon's arm. She was shoved away without hesitation. She fell hard, scraping her knees, pain flaring through joints that had already endured decades. The phones did not lower, they rose higher. The truth was being captured, frame by frame. Marcus focused on breathing. He spoke when he could. Each word was an effort. He identified himself by name. He stated that he was not resisting. He stated that force was being used unlawfully. He did so not with anger, but with resolve. That calm only enraged Harlon further. Authority unchallenged hates composure. Donnelly watched the scene unravel and felt panic set in. He saw the witnesses. He saw the cameras. He realized too late that this moment would not disappear. Fear overrode judgment. He turned away briefly, just enough to believe he was unseen, and raked his own throat with his fingernails. Blood flowed. He spun back toward the crowd, shouting an accusation meant to rewrite reality. It failed instantly. Witnesses shouted back. Phones captured everything. The lie collapsed before it could take hold. Marcus, still pinned, still struggling to breathe, named the act for what it was. His voice carried authority even through pain. That authority unsettled everyone who heard it. By the time Harlon hauled Marcus upright to apply handcuffs, The situation had already slipped beyond his control. He just did not know it yet. The cameras had recorded too much. The witnesses had seen too clearly, and the truth, once visible, does not retreat. This was the moment when the encounter crossed from abuse into exposure. The line had been passed. There would be no quiet reports, no buried footage, no internal excuses. What began as an assertion of power was becoming something far more dangerous for those who wielded it. The violence did not pause. It deepened. John Harlan's knee remained planted at the base of Marcus Thompson's neck, not as a fleeting restraint, but as an assertion meant to crush resistance and broadcast dominance. The pressure stole air slowly, cruelly. Each breath became an effort Marcus had to ration. Pain from his fractured wrist pulsed upward with every heartbeat, sharp and blinding, while blood from his cheek soaked into the concrete beneath his face, gravel cut into his skin. Still, he did not struggle. He did not flail. He understood the trap. Movement would become a story written against him. Silence would be rewritten as guilt. So Marcus did the only thing left to him. He spoke. "I am not resisting," he said, forcing each word out carefully, deliberately, with control. "Your knee is on my neck. This force is excessive and unlawful." His voice was strained but steady, trained by decades of testimony, by years of explaining facts to people who did not want to hear them, around them. The crowd reacted as one, gasps, shouts. Someone cried out that he could not breathe. Phones shook as hands trembled, but they did not lower. Every second was being preserved. Harlon heard the words and responded with anger, not restraint. Calm unnerved him. Composure threatened his authority. "Shut up!" he barked, driving his weight down harder, as if force could erase evidence. To Harlon. This was no longer about suspicion or procedure. It was about control, about proving that the badge still bent reality in his favor. He leaned in close and whispered insults meant to wound, words soaked in bitterness and entitlement. Marcus absorbed them without response. His focus narrowed to one goal. Stay conscious. Stay precise. Let the truth do the work. Dr. Eleanor Hayes pushed forward again, ignoring the pain in her knees and the ache in her hands, her voice cut through the chaos. Sharp and unwavering. She demanded they stop. She demanded a supervisor. She cited the law with clarity born of decades of study and protest. Harlon shoved her aside again, harder this time, sending her backward onto the pavement. A wave of outrage rippled through the witnesses. Several shouted that they had seen everything. A teenager's voice cracked as he begged the officers to stop. Luisa Gomez stepped fully outside now, her phone held with both hands, knuckles white, recording every second. She knew, without anyone telling her, that what she was capturing would matter. Mike Donnelly stood just behind Harlon, frozen. He watched the knee. He watched Marcus's stillness. He watched the growing number of phones pointed directly at them. Fear crept in, cold and sharp. This was not what he imagined policing to be. This was not the controlled authority he had been promised. He felt the moment slipping beyond anything he could manage. Loyalty pulled him one way. Survival pulled him another. Panic won. That panic drove him to an act that would define him forever. Donnelly turned his back to the crowd for a fraction of a second, long enough to convince himself he was unseen. He raised his hands and dragged his fingernails violently across his own throat. Skin tore. Blood spilled immediately, hot and shocking. He inhaled sharply, pain and adrenaline colliding. Then he spun back toward the witnesses, eyes wide, voice high and desperate. "He attacked me. He shouted. You all saw it." The reaction was instant and unforgiving. "No, he didn't. You did that to yourself. It's on camera." Voices overlapped, angry and certain. Luisa shouted from the doorway that she had filmed everything. Dr. Hayes pointed, trembling but resolute, stating clearly what she had seen. Above them, The fixed security camera mounted over the gas station entrance captured the entire sequence in sharp, unbroken detail. There was no missing angle, no confusion, no room for interpretation. Marcus heard the accusation and summoned his voice again, even as pressure crushed his airway. "Officer Donnelly," he said, each word carefully formed. "You have just inflicted injury upon yourself and falsely accused me of assault. That is a serious criminal offense." The words landed with weight. They were not shouted, they were stated. Even Harlon hesitated for a heartbeat. Authority, when spoken with certainty, still carried power. Harlon responded by tightening his grip, anger now edged with something else. Fear. "You think you're smart," he snarled. "You think talking is going to save you." He grabbed Marcus and hauled him upright with unnecessary force. Marcus staggered, his injured arm hung uselessly at his side. Pain flared so sharply it nearly stole his vision. Blood dripped onto the concrete. The crowd gasped as phones zoomed closer, capturing every detail, as Harlon pulled Marcus upright to apply the cuffs. Fabric tore. The tailored jacket split at the seam and slid aside. Sunlight struck metal at Marcus's waist. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Dr. Hayes froze mid-step, her breath catching. "Wait," she said, disbelief creeping into her voice. That badge. Her words cut through the noise like glass. Harlon looked down without thinking. His eyes locked onto the gold star hanging unmistakably from Marcus's belt. The effect was immediate. Color drained from his face. His mouth opened, but no sound came. Donnelly's eyes widened in terror. He stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet, nearly falling into the frame of a teenager's phone. The other officers stiffened, unsure where to look, unsure what to do. Marcus straightened as much as his body would allow. His breathing was labored. Blood marked his face. His left wrist throbbed with every pulse. Still, his posture carried command. He did not shout. He did not boast. He spoke with calm authority that could not be mistaken. "I am Chief Marcus Thompson," he said. "You have just assaulted your commanding officer. You have illegally detained me, searched me, and used excessive force under color of law. These actions constitute serious civil rights violations." Each sentence landed with finality. Radios crackled. No one spoke. Harlon's knees buckled. He dropped to the ground, not out of respect, but out of collapse. "Chief," he stammered, desperation spilling into his voice. "We didn't know. Please." Marcus did not raise his voice when he responded. "You did not need to know who I was," he said evenly. "You needed to follow the law. You chose not to." The crowd erupted. Cheers broke out. Some people cried openly. Others stood in stunned silence, hands over their mouths. Phones continued recording as Marcus reached down with his good hand and took Harlon's radio. His movements were slow but deliberate. "Dispatch," he said, his voice steady despite the pain. "This is Chief Marcus Thompson. Send FBI Civil Rights and Internal Affairs to the Shell Station on Bayview Avenue immediately. 4 officers are suspended pending investigation." In that moment, control shifted completely. What had begun as unchecked violence born of prejudice became exposure sealed by evidence. There would be no quiet reports, no buried footage, no excuses strong enough to outrun the truth. The record was complete, and everyone present understood the same thing. There was no going back. The moment the badge caught the light, authority collapsed in real time. What had seconds earlier been noise, shouting, and aggressive certainty dissolved into stunned quiet. John Harlon remained on his knees, hands hovering uselessly in front of him, his posture no longer commanding but empty, as if the meaning had drained from his uniform. Mike Donnelly stood several steps back, blood streaking his neck, his earlier accusation now ringing in his ears like a confession he could not take back. Sophia Ramirez and Chris Fletcher avoided every camera, every witness, every pair of eyes that now judged them. At the center of it all stood Marcus Thompson, injured, breathing with effort, yet unmistakably in control. Marcus did not raise his voice. He did not savor the reversal. He did not lecture. He spoke with the calm precision of a man who understood that every word would be replayed, dissected, and remembered. "You are relieved of duty," he said to Harlon, his tone even and final, effective immediately. There was no hesitation in his voice, no room for negotiation. The sentence carried weight precisely because it was delivered without anger. Harlon tried to speak. His mouth opened, words forming too late, explanations tumbling over one another in his mind. Marcus stopped him with a simple gesture. "Do not speak," he said. "Anything you say now will become part of a federal record." The warning landed hard. Harlon's shoulders slumped, for the first time since he stepped out of his cruiser. He looked small. Power had left him completely, and he could feel it. Marcus turned toward Donnelly. The younger officer's eyes were wide, unfocused, darting between the cameras and the blood on his own hands. "You will remain where you are," Marcus said. "Medical personnel will document your injuries. Federal investigators will document how they occurred." Donnelly nodded weakly, understanding too late that the lie he had attempted to create was now preserved forever from multiple angles. Panic had sealed his fate. Marcus then faced Ramirez and Fletcher. He did not accuse them. He did not soften his tone. "You did not intervene," he said. "You did not report. You chose silence." The words were measured, but they cut deeply. Both officers lowered their eyes. In that moment, they understood that neutrality had not protected them. Silence had placed them on the wrong side of the record. Around them. The crowd finally exhaled. Some people clapped, not loudly, not triumphantly, but with restrained disbelief. Others cried openly. Dr. Eleanor Hayes stood with her hands clasped together, tears streaming down her face, not from fear or pain, but from vindication. She had spent a lifetime believing that law mattered only when enforced. Here, she was watching enforcement finally turn inward. Luisa Gomez lowered her phone briefly, wiped her eyes, then raised it again. She knew this moment would be studied, replayed, and argued over. She wanted it captured cleanly. Marcus reached for the radio, his injured arm trembling despite his effort to steady it. He held the device in his uninjured hand and spoke clearly. "Dispatch," he said. "This is Chief Marcus Thompson. I am requesting immediate response from Internal Affairs and the FBI Civil Rights Division to the Shell Station on Bayview Avenue. This scene is now under federal jurisdiction." The response crackled back. Stunned but compliant, sirens began to echo faintly in the distance. Marcus then did something no one expected. He addressed the witnesses directly. "Do not stop recording," he said. "Preserve your footage. You will be contacted." His words transformed the crowd. They were no longer bystanders. They were participants in accountability. The instruction validated every shaking hand holding a phone, every person who had chosen not to look away. Paramedics arrived and moved carefully through the crowd, which parted without resistance now. They examined Marcus's wrist, checked his breathing, and documented the bruising already darkening his neck. One medic urged him to lie down. Marcus shook his head. "Not yet." He said, "Secure the scene first." The request was firm, not reckless. Leadership, for Marcus, had never meant comfort. It meant responsibility. As medical staff worked, additional units arrived, this time under very different authority. Internal Affairs officers began separating individuals, marking positions, noting witness names. Federal agents arrived quietly but decisively, their presence immediately shifting the atmosphere. The local officers who had once seemed untouchable now looked uncertain, restrained, and exposed. FBI Special Agent Lisa Chen arrived less than an hour after the call. She surveyed the scene with practiced calm, noting the crowd, the cameras, the blood, and the stunned expressions of officers who now understood the gravity of what they had done. Her eyes met Marcus's briefly. There was no ceremony, no introduction needed. "We'll take it from here," she said. Marcus nodded once. "I expect nothing less," he replied. Harlon was placed in handcuffs by federal agents, not by Marcus. The sound of the cuffs closing around his wrists was sharp and final. The crowd watched silently as he was lifted to his feet. His face was pale. His earlier confidence had evaporated completely. He tried once more to speak as he was led away, his voice cracking with desperation. Marcus did not respond. Some conversations end without acknowledgement. Donnelly was escorted separately, still muttering weak explanations, still insisting that everything had happened too fast. The agents did not argue. They did not challenge him. They did not need to. Cameras had already answered every question he tried to avoid. Ramirez and Fletcher were taken aside and informed of their status. Cooperation was mentioned. Consequences were implied. Both nodded, realizing that inaction had cost them far more than they had imagined. By the time Marcus was finally guided onto a stretcher, news alerts were already lighting up phones across the country. Videos had gone live, commentators were reacting, millions were watching, but Marcus focused only on the moment in front of him. Reform was no longer a promise he would make from behind a desk. It was an obligation written in pain, evidence, and public record. As the stretcher doors closed, Marcus allowed himself one controlled breath. His wrist throbbed, his neck burned, his body ached in ways that would linger. This was not how he had planned his first day as chief, but it was how change often began. Not with speeches, not with policies, but with exposure so complete that denial became impossible. Across the street, the Oak Ridge Police Department headquarters stood unchanged. The flags still waved. The glass still reflected the sky. But everything beneath them had shifted. The old guard had revealed itself fully, in daylight. Before witnesses, it could not intimidate or silence. And now, under Marcus Thompson's command, the department would have no choice but to confront what it had tried for too long to ignore. The aftermath unfolded with a speed that stunned even seasoned investigators. By the time Marcus Thompson was taken from the gas station to the hospital, the incident had already escaped the limits of Oak Ridge. The videos moved faster than any official statement ever could. They crossed state lines in minutes, national borders in hours. Millions watched a black police chief pinned to the ground by his own officers. They heard his calm voice naming violations as they happened. They saw a younger officer injure himself in panic. They witnessed the instant a badge shattered a lie. There was no ambiguity. There was no space for spin. The truth had arrived intact, at the hospital. Physicians confirmed what Marcus already felt in his bones. His wrist was fractured cleanly. Ligaments were torn. His neck showed deep bruising consistent with dangerous restraint. Cuts along his face required stitches. He endured the examinations without complaint, answering questions clearly, correcting details when needed. Pain did not distract him. His focus remained fixed on the consequences that were already in motion. This was not just an assault. It was a systemic failure, and it demanded a systemic response. Within minutes of Marcus's departure, federal agents secured the Shell station on Bayview Avenue. The scene transformed from a place of chaos into a controlled investigative site. Yellow tape went up. Access was restricted. FBI Special Agent Lisa Chen supervised every step. Surveillance footage was seized. Dash cameras were downloaded. Body camera data was preserved in full, without gaps. Radio logs were pulled. Dispatch records were frozen. No device was overlooked. No delay was tolerated. The investigation moved with urgency born of certainty. This was not a question of what happened. It was a question of how deep it went. John Harlon was taken into federal custody that same afternoon. The charges were read carefully, formally, without theatrics. Deprivation of civil rights under color of law, aggravated assault, false imprisonment. Each carried significant prison exposure, each stripped away another layer of the authority he once wielded so casually. His badge was removed. His weapon was logged as evidence. His uniform became irrelevant. The man who had barked orders hours earlier now spoke barely above a whisper. Seniority meant nothing against recorded fact. Mike Donnelly was treated for his self-inflicted wounds under guard. Medical staff documented the injuries with precision. Investigators asked him to explain what had happened. They played the footage. They asked again. His statements contradicted the video almost immediately. The record reflected that contradiction in plain language. By nightfall, Donnelly faced his own set of charges: fabrication of evidence, filing a false report, civil rights violations. The act meant to save him had become the clearest proof of guilt. Sophia Ramirez and Chris Fletcher were placed on administrative leave pending review. Their interviews were calm, methodical, and unforgiving. They admitted they had seen nothing that justified the force used. They admitted they had stayed silent. Their cooperation was noted. Their failure to intervene was also noted. Silence, once again, carried consequences. Marcus remained hospitalized overnight. Reporters gathered outside in growing numbers. Cameras waited. Questions piled up. He declined interviews. Instead, he released a short written statement through the city attorney. It acknowledged the investigation. It confirmed full cooperation. It stated plainly that accountability would be complete. Nothing more was required. The footage spoke louder than any press conference ever could. By the next morning, Oak Ridge was under national scrutiny. Federal officials confirmed the investigation publicly. Civil rights organizations demanded oversight agreements. Legal scholars explained the violations in simple terms. Police unions issued carefully worded statements that avoided defending the indefensible. Local politicians were forced to respond. Silence was no longer a viable option. Within 48 hours, the videos had been viewed hundreds of millions of times. Experts paused frames and analyzed posture, timing, and language. Former officers described proper procedure and pointed out every deviation. Commentators replayed the moment Donnelly injured himself, the moment the badge appeared, the moment authority reversed. The narrative did not change. It hardened. Facts have a way of doing that. Marcus returned to headquarters with his wrist in a cast and bruises still visible along his neck. He did not retreat behind closed doors. He convened an emergency departmental briefing. Attendance was mandatory. The room was silent when he entered. He spoke without notes, without embellishment. "This department will be examined in full," he said. "Every use of force, every complaint, every supervisory decision, there will be no exceptions." His voice was calm. The message was absolute. Internal Affairs expanded its review immediately. Patterns emerged quickly. Complaints dismissed without inquiry, reports softened by supervisors, officers shielded by seniority. What had been described as isolated incidents revealed themselves as a culture. That culture was now exposed to federal light. Subpoenas followed. Training materials, disciplinary files, promotion records, emails, text messages. Nothing remained sealed. The department's public image fractured under scrutiny. But Marcus did not attempt to defend it. Exposure was the price of reform. He accepted that cost without hesitation. John Harlan's personal life unraveled with brutal speed. His union declined representation. His pension was frozen pending conviction. His wife filed for divorce. His eldest son cut contact entirely. The social circle that once reinforced his worldview disappeared. The authority he had relied on evaporated. Donnelly fared no better. His attempt to deceive made him a symbol of cowardice, even among those inclined to excuse misconduct. Inside holding. He was isolated. outside. His name became shorthand for disgrace. The stigma attached itself permanently. Marcus watched the consequences unfold without commentary. He did not celebrate downfall. He did not seek vengeance. Justice, to him, was not about spectacle. It was about correction. His attention remained fixed on rebuilding a department that had revealed its worst instincts in public. By the end of the week, federal prosecutors announced formal indictments. Court dates were set. Oversight frameworks were drafted. Independent monitors were named. The Oak Ridge Police Department was no longer just a local agency. It had become a national case study in accountability. What began as an unlawful stop at a gas station had evolved into a full reckoning. Evidence had spoken, authority had been stripped, and the work Marcus Thompson had come to Oak Ridge to do was no longer theoretical. It was active, irreversible, and unfolding under the eyes of an entire nation. The trial unfolded under a weight that few federal courtrooms ever carried. From the first morning, it was clear this case was not about competing versions of events. It was about accountability, recorded in real time and preserved without gaps. John Harlon and Mike Donnelly sat at the defense table in a San Francisco federal courtroom, no longer protected by uniforms, seniority, or silence. They wore suits that could not disguise the absence of authority. Cameras were barred from the room, but the evidence had already been seen by millions. The courtroom felt less like a place of discovery and more like a place where facts were given their legal names. Federal prosecutors moved with restraint and precision. They did not raise their voices. They did not editorialize. They let the record speak. The first exhibit was the fixed camera above the gas station entrance. The wide angle showed the approach, the block of the exit, the posture, the distance closed without cause. Then came the dash cameras, then the body cameras, then the bystander videos, layered and synchronized, each confirming the others down to the second. Jurors watched Marcus Thompson calmly identify himself by name. They watched suspicion invented aloud. They watched the takedown, the knee, the stillness, the shouted command to stop resisting when there was no resistance. They watched Donnelly turn away and injure himself. They watched the lie collapse in real time. And finally, they watched the badge appear. The courtroom stayed silent. No defense theory could compete with what was visible. The prosecution called witnesses in an order that built clarity without drama. A forensic analyst testified to timestamps and angles, explaining how independent recordings aligned perfectly. A medical expert described the injuries, separating self-inflicted wounds from injuries caused by force. A use of force instructor explained standard procedure, then explained each deviation. The words were careful. The conclusions were unavoidable. Dr. Eleanor Hayes took the stand on the third day. She walked slowly to the witness box, steady despite her age, and spoke without notes. She described the moment she recognized danger. She described the knee, the refusal to stop, the calm voice beneath the pressure. She explained why she intervened and why she was pushed away. "I taught constitutional law for decades," she said evenly. "What I witnessed was not a mistake. It was abuse." The defense asked a single question and then stopped. There was nothing to add. Luisa Gomez testified next. Her hands shook slightly as she spoke, but her voice held. She explained why she began recording. She explained why she did not stop. She described the moment she saw Donnelly hurt himself and the instant she realized the lie would fail, when the defense suggested confusion. The prosecutor replayed her video in open court. The questioning ended. Special Agent Lisa Chen testified to the investigation. She explained how footage from separate sources aligned to the second, how radio logs confirmed no threat call, how medical documentation contradicted Donnelly's report, how text messages sent afterward revealed attempts to coordinate explanations. This case did not rely on inference. She said, it relied on records. Her testimony was clinical. It was devastating. Marcus Thompson testified last. He did not speak as a man seeking sympathy. He spoke as a professional explaining a failure of duty. He described his restraint, his effort to de-escalate, his decision to narrate events aloud so the record would be clear. He explained why calm matters when power is abused. He described the pain briefly, without emphasis, then returned to principle. When asked what he wanted from the court, he did not hesitate. Accountability. He said, "So this does not happen again." The room remained still. The defense attempted to argue stress, confusion, split-second judgment. The prosecutor responded by replaying the footage again, slowly, frame by frame. Seconds stretched, confusion vanished, intent remained. The jury deliberated for less than a day. The verdicts came back unanimous, guilty on all counts. There was no gasp, no outburst, only a quiet understanding that the outcome had been inevitable from the moment the cameras captured the truth. Sentencing followed weeks later. The judge spoke plainly, without flourish. He described the harm done to Marcus Thompson, to the department, and to public trust. He emphasized the abuse of authority and the deliberate nature of the actions. John Harlon was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison for civil rights violations under color of law and aggravated assault. The judge noted Harlon's seniority as an aggravating factor, not a shield. Mike Donnelly received 17 years for fabrication of evidence, false reporting, and civil rights violations. The judge stated clearly that Donnelly's attempt to create a false narrative compounded the harm. Sophia Ramirez and Chris Fletcher, having cooperated but failed to intervene, were each sentenced to 4 years for their roles. All were barred permanently from law enforcement. The city of Oak Ridge agreed to a civil settlement with Marcus Thompson in the amount of $4.5 million. Marcus accepted the settlement without ceremony and announced immediately that every dollar would be directed to body camera programs, independent oversight initiatives, and anti-bias training organizations. This was never about compensation. He said in a brief statement, it was about correction. The decision shifted the public conversation. The money became a tool, not a prize. The personal consequences were severe and lasting. Harlon lost his pension. His home went into foreclosure. His marriage ended quietly. In prison. Stripped of the authority that had defined him, he struggled to adjust. Months later, he wrote a letter acknowledging his prejudice and asking for forgiveness. Marcus never replied. Some accountability does not require closure. Donnelly's consequences followed a different path. Within prison, his actions defined him. The attempt to deceive marked him permanently. Years later, after release, he sought community service as a form of atonement. The record followed him everywhere. Redemption, if it came at all, would be slow and incomplete. For Marcus, the trial was not an ending. It was confirmation. The verdicts affirmed what evidence had already proven. Abuse collapses when documented. Authority does not survive the record when it is misused. He returned to Oak Ridge with a mandate no chief ever wants but fully understands. Reform would be comprehensive, public, and permanent. As the courtroom emptied on the final day, there was no celebration. There was finality. The law had spoken clearly, and for the first time in Oak Ridge's history, it had spoken inward, without hesitation, without protection, and without fear. Reform did not arrive as a slogan or a press conference. It arrived as sustained pressure, applied carefully and without pause. Marcus Thompson understood that what had been exposed in Oak Ridge could not be corrected with gestures. Trust, once broken, does not return because it is requested. It returns only when systems change in ways that cannot be quietly reversed. From his first full day back in the office, Marcus made it clear that reform would not be symbolic. It would be structural, documented, and permanent. His first directive removed discretion from the most sensitive decisions. Every use of force, without exception, would be reviewed by an independent civilian oversight board with subpoena power. No internal filtering, no quiet resolutions. Findings would be published, names would be attached. Officers understood immediately that the old protections no longer applied. Some resisted, some complained. Marcus did not argue. He enforced. Body camera policy was rewritten line by line. Cameras were mandatory at all times on duty. Any interruption required written justification and immediate supervisor review. Footage could not be delayed, edited, or selectively released. Failure to comply resulted in suspension. Repeated violations resulted in termination. Within months, compliance reached nearly 100%. Behavior changed accordingly. When actions are recorded, restraint follows. Training was rebuilt from the ground up. Annual seminars were replaced with weekly instruction, bias recognition, de-escalation under stress, constitutional limits. Officers were tested, not just briefed. Those who failed were retrained. Those who refused were dismissed. Marcus made no apologies for the attrition. A smaller department with integrity was better than a larger one without it. Community oversight meetings were scheduled monthly and held in public spaces, not government buildings. Marcus attended every session during the first year. He did not stand at a podium. He sat among residents and listened. When people described fear, he did not correct them. When they described anger, he did not defend the past. He acknowledged failure directly. He explained changes clearly. He answered questions without deflection, slowly. The tone shifted. Complaints initially increased, not because misconduct rose, but because reporting finally felt safe. Marcus treated that increase as progress. Within a year, measurable outcomes followed. Use of force incidents dropped sharply. Citizen complaints declined after peaking early. Crime fell without aggressive tactics. Clearance rates improved as cooperation returned. Officers began to understand that accountability did not weaken their authority. It stabilized it. Data replaced defensiveness. Evidence replaced excuses. National attention followed. Departments across the country requested guidance. Marcus declined appearances that framed him as a hero. He accepted those focused on policy and implementation at police academies. He spoke plainly about what had failed and why. At congressional hearings, he emphasized oversight as prevention, not punishment. His message was consistent. Abuse survives where documentation fails. He said, "Reform survives only when transparency cannot be undone." Journalists eventually labeled the changes the Washington model, a framework built on independent review, mandatory recording, and civilian authority. Marcus did not trademark it. He did not promote it. He allowed others to adopt it freely. Several departments did, some succeeded, others struggled. Marcus understood that reform required leadership willing to absorb backlash. Not everyone was. The Shell station on Bayview Avenue became a quiet landmark. At the request of residents, a small bronze plaque was installed near the entrance. It bore a simple inscription, "Site where justice was recorded." Marcus did not attend the installation. He did not want the moment personalized. He wanted it remembered accurately. Evidence, not individuals, had forced change, privately. The cost remained. His wrist never healed perfectly. Cold mornings brought a dull ache that reminded him of the pavement and the pressure. He accepted it without complaint. Pain was easier to carry than silence. He never spoke publicly about forgiveness. Forgiveness, he believed, was personal. Accountability was institutional. John Harlon served his sentence largely isolated, stripped of the authority that had once defined him. Years into incarceration, he admitted to a reporter that prejudice had shaped his actions. The admission changed nothing. Society moved forward without him. Mike Donnelly's path was different, but no less heavy. After release, he sought supervised community work with at-risk youth. Some accepted his presence. Many did not. Redemption, Marcus believed, could not be demanded. It could only be earned, quietly, over time. on a quiet afternoon. Marcus stood in his office overlooking the bay. The water was calm. The city moved steadily below. Inside the department, procedures were followed without drama. Cameras were visible. Reports were thorough. Officers greeted residents by name. Trust did not rely on promises anymore. It relied on proof. Marcus understood that progress was fragile, that vigilance could not relax. Reform was not a destination. It was maintenance. He thought briefly of the morning at the gas station, not with anger, but with clarity. That moment had stripped away illusion and left only evidence. It had revealed who would abuse power when unobserved, and who would remain still and speak when crushed beneath it. The difference mattered. Marcus Thompson did not seek to become a symbol. Circumstance made him one. Response defined him. He refused to let violence define his legacy. He let accountability define the system. Oak Ridge changed because it had to. Other cities followed because they saw that change was possible. The legacy was not perfect. No reform ever is. But it was real, measurable, and sustained. And in a nation watching closely, it proved something essential. When truth is recorded, when courage holds steady, and when authority finally examines itself without fear. Justice does not whisper, it speaks clearly, and once heard, it cannot be ignored. Thank you for watching and standing with stories that demand accountability. If this story moved you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes justice still matters. Your support helps these stories be heard.